2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 8 says this. Always remember that Jesus Christ, a descendant of King David, was raised from the dead. This is the good news that I preach. And so this is Paul writing to Timothy, which is where we get the name 1st and 2nd Timothy. They're two letters to Timothy. And so Paul's writing about this good news that he's preaching. And that's another word for the gospel. He's preaching the good news about Jesus. And Jesus is this story, when you grab the Bible and you open it up, you might think, Jesus is kind of in the later chapters in the New Testament. But really, the story of the gospel begins in the beginning. Even when you open up in the book of Genesis, we see things like in Genesis 3:15, after Adam and Eve have sinned and sin enters the world, there's this little thing, he will, talking about, her descendant says, he will strike your head, but you will strike his heel. And they're getting to this idea of the Redeemer continues throughout the Old Testament, their Hebrew Bible. Job, which is one of the oldest books in the Bible, in the middle of that, in Job 25 says, but as for me, I know my Redeemer lives, and he will stand upon the earth at last. And after my body is decayed, yet in my body I will see God. And so there's this theme of a Redeemer to come, and that's what we celebrate at Easter. And then there's the promise of the Davidic king, and he will, justice from his throne of his ancestor David. All this stuff is coming. And then ultimately Jesus comes. He is the Messiah, the chosen one. And so God has brought redemption. And so Paul is at this critical juncture of right after Jesus came. Paul missed it. Jesus shows up later, if you don't know the story, and kind of gets Paul going in the right direction. And with that, he's proclaiming the gospel, the good news. And it's not something new, but it's something that's fully explained at this point. And then it's something we celebrate. And that's what we celebrate coming up on Easter. I know it's on my mind. We're planning egg hunts and things like that have nothing to do with Jesus, but they're a lot of fun to do. But within that, it's like we have this hope, this celebration of the gospel. And so Paul continues this. He says, and because I preach this good news, I'm suffering and have been chained like a criminal. But the word of God cannot be chained. So I'm willing to endure anything if it will bring salvation and eternal glory to Christ Jesus, to those God has chosen. Suffering. Most of us in America probably don't suffer a lot for the gospel. If you become a believer and your friends aren't believers, and sometimes it should change your behavior, your way of doing things, but most of us are not, at threat of our lives daily at work because of the gospel. I was reading a commentary that was written in part of the majority world, like another country, and they were talking about the common things that happen, and some of them sounded so American, and then the other one was like, and often threaten to be beaten because you don't go along with a scheme to defraud the government, and I'm like, no, that's probably not happening to most of us. But in other contexts, there are some scary things that can happen when you're a believer and a follower of Jesus. And I'm not to say that it doesn't hurt if someone unfriends you on Facebook because you're a believer. I'm not saying, because you might get excluded from social things. That's not. But it's a level of suffering probably most of us aren't going to experience here. And so Paul is suffering for the gospel, but you'll suffer for things you care about. Some of you have children. When you have children, those of you who don't have children, it totally changes your life, because suddenly this little thing shows up and it's squiggly and nasty and cool and beautiful. They're like little lizards. They come out. They're awesome. But I had a couple of them. They're great. But when this little thing comes out, you'll do anything for that child, right? And so many of us, it's like, I think a lot of people work jobs they hate. It's great if I know some of you have jobs you love. That's awesome. I really suffer in my job. I have to work with this group of people every Sunday. No, I'm kidding. I love you guys. We often we do things that maybe we don't even enjoy because we suffer because we need to provide for our kids. And when something is really of value to us, we'll suffer. We'll work. And if you're married, it's kind of the same thing. It's like a good marriage. You often will sacrifice things because you love your wife, or vice versa. I can only speak because, I may want to go hunt all day or fish or do all those things, but times you know I'm going to stay home and do all those little project list things that need to get done instead and load the dishwasher. And often love means sacrifice. And because Paul loves the people, he loves God, and he wants the gospel to spread, he's willing to go through this. But following Jesus often means suffering. And being a person of faith, it's sort of a double thing, because I remember specifically one job I had, and I worked in an office, and because I was a good employee and actually worked 9 to 5, or 8 to 4, I forget what my hours were there. It was a job I had in California. There was certain people in the office that loved me because I just worked. And I've told some of you, it was before we had fancy headsets and stuff, and I like taped, or I rubber banded the phone to my face so I could work more efficiently, and everyone would come by and laugh. And that's why I'm glad there weren't cell phone than pictures, or maybe it would be a funny memory to pop up on someone's timeline. But you had people but also, because I was a believer and a follower of Jesus, there were some people who didn't like me because of my beliefs. And so, being a follower of Jesus, some people they might like you for some things, they might dislike you for other things. And we're not promised a free ride without suffering. Christ suffered in death to save the church, and Paul is suffering in life to help the churches and spread the gospel. Today, I think so much about like the first world problems I have, and our suffering. I had a little bit of a sinus infection last week, and some of you can probably still hear it a little bit in my voice, perhaps. But it's, I have a cold, and I'll sit on the bed and I'll whine all day, because a man cold is something, if women don't understand, there's this level of cold that men have that's really probably on par with childbirth. I'm just saying. We'll watch, but I mean, that's kind of like, that's the extent of there's things I have to do that are hard. I mean, I do hard labor, I do heavy stuff sometimes, and it's not that much of a suffering. And this suffering, Paul's focus is on, who he's suffering for. He's suffering for the church. He's suffering for Jesus. And we'll suffer for a lot of things that we value, too. Like, I've spent most of my life in pursuit of sporting things, and as most of you know, I like to pick things up and put things down, and it's, you'll work hard, and for a while I was competitive in powerlifting and strongman, and I loved it, and I would do things to my body that were like horrible, like literally, I've told some of you, it felt like the day after training strongman feels like you've been in a severe car accident. And I used to have to soak in a tub so I could move the next day. And I gladly did that several times a week because I had the goal of lifting giant heavy things. And then your body rips in half and you can't do it anymore. But you'll suffer because you want to win, right? You'll suffer because you have this goal that's important to you. And a lot of times, I think if we go through suffering, we go through hard things, you go through times that maybe because of your faith, you experience some level of suffering. When you keep the goal in mind, it's easier to go through it. When you keep in mind why you're doing it, God doesn't promise a life free of suffering, but he does promise he'll be with us. He does promise he'll work through us. And ultimately, that it will be worth it in the end. It says, I may be chained, but the gospel may be unchained. I just want to say, that's a dad joke. Any good pun in Scripture, thank you, Paul. But it's really this great play on words, but it's truth. Because you can lock up somebody for preaching the gospel, but the gospel is something that just couldn't stop spreading. In Isaiah 55, it says this in verse 11, "It is the same with my words," God speaking. "I will send it out, and it always produces fruit. It will accomplish all I want it to, and it will prosper everywhere I send it." Some of you might know it more, the King James. We'll drop a King James line for you there, Dana. "So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void." And so God's purposes won't be thwarted. You can put Paul in jail, it's still going to get out. And so, Paul appears to be arrested here by Nero. And ultimately, if we know the story, it doesn't end well for him. But it doesn't mean that it didn't accomplish God's purpose. And I always think of persecution, it's like puffing on a dandelion. Like some of you have dandelions in your lawn. My lawn is nothing but dandelions and clover. I think it's for the pollinators, or I don't want to pay any money to grow something that I can't eat. So for a while when I lived in Magnolia, it was like I had to have the lawn like everyone else, and it's like you had to like do all the things. And man, that's a lot of work for something you can't eat. So I just gave up and moved to Dover. It's like when you puff the dandelion, if you meant to destroy it when you blew on it, it didn't work because it goes everywhere. And that's the gospel. Throughout history, when people try to suppress the gospel, they try to get rid of it, the end result is it spreads even more. There's this mission story. I wish I could find it. I still remember reading it. I remember where I was, but it's like I couldn't find the story. And then the internet died last night, so I couldn't keep looking for it anyway. Anyone else lose power? Like that's a real struggle. It's suffering for the Lord. We lost power. I just went to bed. And then I woke up at 3 o'clock in the morning, right around the time change, because the clock jumped. And apparently, I tried to go through the house and turn off lights, but I must have turned some on too. So like at some point, all the lights in the house came on. You're like, wake up startled, and I couldn't even figure out where some of the switches were because I'm alone this weekend. Don't tell Denise that. Anyway, and so this mission story. I remember, and it was this guy. He's being held at gunpoint, and they're telling him to stop preaching the gospel. And he says something to the effect of, "You can kill me, but I will never die." And it was like, that's a bold faith statement, right? Like that's just saying, hey, I'm not going to stop preaching the gospel. I think all of us hope and wish we had that kind of courage in that moment. And it's a great, like you can kill this body, but I'm not die. That's faith in God. Now, in the story, the gun jams and everything, and that's pretty awesome. But here's the thing. Even if the gun didn't jam, you can kill the messenger, but you can't kill the message. And there's times where God might protect you from death if you end up in a place where you're suffering, but he may not. And ultimately, it's about the spreading of the gospel. And 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 says, "This is a trustworthy saying, if we die with him, we will also live with him." The call to faith is one of dying to yourself. Last week, we kind of went over a couple different things in the letter here. We talked about, the soldier. The soldier, Paul says he does the will of his commanding officers. Like, and I wasn't in the military, but when I talk to military people, basically, I think of Private Gump when he puts together the rifle real fast. Some of you know the scene, and it's like he's like the drill sergeant's really like, "Why'd you put it together so fast?" He's like, "'Cause you told me to, drill sergeant." And then he calls him a genius in a much more colorful way than I would say, especially from the pulpit. But point being is, like, when you do what you're told, you're rewarded. And that's, in the gospel, in following Jesus, if we want to please God, we don't just live in a way that pleases ourselves, but we live in a way that pleases God. And again, it reminds me a lot of marriage. I was thinking about this. Marriage is tough, and if you don't believe it's tough, you probably haven't been married. Marriage is a challenging journey. And I often, when I counsel younger couples especially, go in, and they don't always believe me, but it's like if you enter into marriage to get something, but you're not expecting to give something, it usually doesn't end well. And it takes both people loving, giving, serving to make marriage what it's meant to be. And often that's how they last, because it takes this daily selfless service to one another. You have to be thinking about the other person. And faith isn't just, some people like add faith to their life, like, well, now I just, now I go to church too. And it's not bad to go to church. Obviously, we want you to go to church. But faith is more than just showing up at a building and listening to a message. It's more than maybe just listening online. It's a reordering of your life and your priorities around Jesus. And, Matthew 16, Jesus says it this way. He says to his disciples, if anyone wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you'll lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it. And what do you benefit if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? And you lose your life. Now, for some, that can be literal. You might actually lose your life, but for many of us, it's figurative. And in John 10:10, Jesus says, I come that they may have life and have it to the full. And this full life, this better way of living, most of us, in the U.S. may not, be in the position where someone holds a gun to our head, like the story earlier, and, they're about to pull the trigger. But, living faithfully for 30 years may actually be harder, I think. Because it's this long life of living and following Jesus, and there's many temptations, and you have to constantly, put, your own desires sometimes in the second seat. Now, I don't have any problem losing weight. I can go on a diet for a week. The problem is staying on it 2 weeks, right? Or a lifetime. And it's like, when I was wrestling, I would have to do things like, coach would be like, can you lose 30 pounds in 2 days? The answer is yes. Problem is, I remember one time I weighed in, I think I weighed 30 pounds more than I had it weigh in the night before. Because it's one thing to lose it, but to that constant dedication. And that's where most of us struggle with our diets. We get all jazzed about the diet. We go into Walmart and buy a bunch of vegetables and let them rot in our fridge later. But it's that constant attention and living faithfully. And Colossians puts it this way. Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, starting verse 1, since you have been raised to new life with Christ, set your sights on the realities of heaven, where Christ sits in the place of honor at God's right hand. Think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. For you died to this life, and your real life is hidden with Christ in God. And when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to the whole world, you will share in his glory. So raised to new life with Christ. When you follow Christ, it's really about, putting your whole life into it. Often, when I do marriage, I don't know why I'm thinking of weddings so much today, but maybe wedding season is coming up and I'm going to do some, I don't know. Some of you guys have wedding season, right? That whole, I don't know, spring and summer, you're going to weddings with your plus one. But in marriage, we often have the candle ceremony, and sometimes people do sand, different things, but the candles have kind of been the traditional one in America, and you each light the candle, and I say something after it says something like all your aims, ambitions, and hopes, your whole outlook, are now together as one, and it's a great symbol, but that's really what following Christ is. It's like kind of getting married. It's saying, hey, now my interests, my ambitions, my hopes aren't just what I want, but I want to follow Christ. I want to live his way. And it's often harder, but again, it's that full life. Because sometimes the things we think are hard are actually a better way of living. But set your sights on the realities of heaven. We have to focus on the goal and the prize. I think of a lot of spiritual things in relation to working out, and it's probably because I like to work out, because I like to pick things up and put things down, But it's like when you have to kind of when you visualize a gym goal, like maybe you want to get in shape or have abs, or I have abs; they're just covered in a layer of protective bubble wrap. But you might visualize a gym goal. And so okay, because I have this goal ahead that's important to me, you can drive past the Taco Bell without stopping. You can it's tough. I was clean for a year, but then I went into Walmart. My dealer was right out there out front, selling Girl Scout cookies. Man, those things are hard to pass up. Like, I go out the cart entrance, to avoid them, Anyone else? Okay, two of us, okay. But, because you have a goal, you're able to kind of say no to some things. And it's the same with faith. If we have this goal, we set our sights on things. Or it's like driving. Have you ever been driving and, run into a ditch? Hopefully not. But the way you eliminate that is you focus on what's ahead. And a lot of times in life, we tend to look just one step ahead because, we struggle, something's interesting to us, and we want to do it. But if we really look ahead to the goal of faith is to please God and for eternity, when we focus on that, it's easier to say no to things in this world that interest us that we shouldn't be interested in. Just think about the things of heaven, not the things of earth. But, we can focus on the better things versus the temptation now. I think of a diet. When I'm trying to eat well, and that's periodically I try to get better because it's I start off eating well, and then it's little things slip into your diet, and next thing you know, you're drinking bacon grease. I mean, I'm just saying, I've been there. Some of you are like, no, I've never gone that far. I wonder how Peeps would be dipped in bacon grease. And thank you, whoever this week contributed to my Peep addiction. But when you diet, you have to focus on the healthy meal, not thinking about the cheesesteak you really wanted, right? And so exercise, you can have a bad attitude and, think about the pain and discomfort, or you can have a good attitude and think about I'm going to be healthier, I'm going to live longer or better. And all of us crave satisfaction, content, and happiness, but ultimately the things that we stuff in there to give it to us don't give us satisfaction if it's not the things that God has for us. So the great theologian Sir Michael Philip Mick Jagger says, I can't get no satisfaction, but I try and I try and I try. Ultimately, life is more about the stuff that we focus on in this life. It says, for you died to this life. Our death in Christ is not physical death, but it's kind of getting rid of the things that bind us and control us and putting our faith in Christ. 1 Timothy 2 says this in verse 12, if we endure hardship, we will reign with him. If we deny him, he will deny us. Again, earlier we said, deny yourself, pick up your cross. And that's what it means to follow Jesus. But in talking about persecution, Jesus says these two things. He says, do not be afraid of those who kill your body. They cannot touch your soul. Fear only God, who can destroy both soul and body in hell. But everyone who denies me here on earth, I will also deny before my Father in heaven. It's not all puppies and rainbows. It was funny, I was listening to a sermon and the pastor said that. I'm like, I say that. But it's not all puppies and rainbows. But we have this hope to eternal reward. Jesus says to the faithful church in Revelation chapter 3, verse 21, those who are victorious will sit with me on the throne, just as I was victorious and sat with my Father on the throne. Life can be hard now, but there's an ultimate reward when you're faithful. Honestly, whether you're a Christian or a non-Christian, life can be hard. If it's not, you're probably too young to know how much your parents suffer. But ultimately, we look for hope in reward in heaven. And we often go through hard things. Hebrews 12 says this, starting in verse 7. As you endure this divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as his own children. Whoever heard of a child who is never disciplined by his father? If God doesn't discipline you as he does all his children, it means you are illegitimate and not really his children. Since we are respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, shouldn't we submit even more to the discipline of the Father of our spirits and live forever? Sidebar our sermon, when we talk discipline, we're not talking beatings. That's a whole nother conversation. Don't go there. Many take the idea of discipline and turn it into abuse. But what we're talking about is sometimes you go through hard things. As a parent, it's tough when your kids start growing up because, you have to sometimes let them not, go through hard things. And they make bad choices. You can't go in and rescue them at school. Like sometimes they just have to get in trouble and take the punishment. And they learn. And so, if they don't budget their time and then they're trying to do assignment and have to stay up all night, well, you learn. There's things. And so not everything we go through that's hard is, just abuse. It's often to allow us to learn something. Often we go through trials, we may not feel like God pays attention or cares. C.S. Lewis, though, said this: pain insists on being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. God allows trials and uses them to train us and prepare us. We often question God in the middle of a trial, or maybe that's just me, are you still there? Do you care? Am I really your child? We may feel like God is not on our side when we go through hard things, but it may actually show that how much God is on our side, that he allows us to do that, go through things. Our discipline and trials often reveal that. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13 says, if we are unfaithful, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny who he is. Now, it's interesting because, I read a lot of commentaries and books and, kind of trying to get at what Paul's saying here. What does it mean for us to be unfaithful? And I don't think it's, like permanently unfaithful. But what I think of is like Peter. And, we're nearing Easter, so we'll be talking about, Peter and Jesus. And, when Jesus goes up for trial, Peter says, I'm not going to deny you, because that's how Peter is. And then what does he do? He denies him, 3 times. And then ultimately, Peter, he feels horrible about it, because he realized, the rooster crows, and he realized he's denied Jesus just like Jesus had said he would. And then later, he's, Peter's on the beach fishing, and or he's on fishing. Jesus shows up on the beach, and there's this cool scene where Peter jumps out of the boat and swims there, and all kinds of stuff. And he's just like, and then if you read it, Jesus restores him 3 times, just like he had been denied 3 times. And so Peter was unfaithful. Jesus was still faithful. And it's not a condemning thing, but it's, even in the spite of our unfaithfulness, where we struggle and fail and fall, God is still faithful. And God still wants to restore us and use us. And, Jesus is our high priest who gets us. We might stumble, but ultimately he's faithful. A commentator said this, and I liked how they said it. Jesus is faithful. He will stay by our side even when we have endured so much that we seem to have no faith left. We may be faithless at times, but Jesus is faithful to his promise to be with us to the very end of the age. Verse 14, which, some commentators stick with the next section, but it says, remind everyone about these things and command them in God's presence to stop fighting over words. Such arguments are useless. They can ruin those who hear them. Remind everyone of these things. There's nothing that I'm saying today that's new. Like, some people like to go to certain preachers because they say new things. You probably shouldn't come up with something real new. It's pretty much the same thing for 2,000 years. I mean, hopefully, we can say it maybe in a way that connects or things with you. But it's, it's important things, and it's important to be reminded because we forget, right? I was at a meeting, and the speaker was talking, and I'd forgotten this event, and he turns to me and he goes, he calls me Pastor Jeff because I'm old, but he's like, Pastor Jeff actually during my interview to get ministerial credentials asked me very sternly to name the 16 fundamental truths of the Assemblies of God in reverse order, and I panicked. And that's the kind of stuff I do, and then I laugh, and then he said, then I laughed, and he was at ease, and, he asked me afterwards if I remember that, and I was like, no, but that's the kind of stuff I do in interviews all the time, but then it was like, I was like, wait a minute, I do remember that, I can remember kind of the room. I had to be reminded, though, and a lot of times, one of the reasons we come to church and we hear truths that maybe we've heard before, is because we need to be reminded of these truths. There's a story I love, and it's this grandfather, he was talking to his grandson about going to church and why you need to go to church all the time. And he told him to go, fill up this bucket and bring it to him. And he goes to fill up the bucket, and it's got a hole in it. And by the time he gets there, it's all out. And he's like, goes back and forth for a bunch of trips. And he's finally like, Grandpa, this just doesn't work. It's a leaky bucket. And he goes, hey, we're all leaky buckets. And that's why we need to go to church. And so the truth is, like, life is hard sometimes outside of here. It can be difficult. There can be challenges to your faith, and that's why I'm not preaching to people who are at church or why you should go to church, but I would say, it's something that encourages in our faith is because we're all leaky buckets, and that's why it's important to connect with people, to be in relationships with people, to be at church together. It's to remind us of truths that we know, and that's what Paul's saying here. He says, remind us and stop fighting over words. I send, to be married to me has got to be a challenge. Because I get on, anyone send their wife memes? A lot of memes. Sometimes I think Denise is just like, what are you doing? You sent me like 35 memes or like clips that I think are interesting and it's, I sent her one this week, and then it was like, I think it got taken down because it probably offended someone in the group I'm in, and that's awesome. But I wish I could find the clip. But anyway, disclaimer, I don't hate the King James Version, but it's going to sound like that for a moment. But, there was this guy, and he was preaching, he was like, I can correct the Greek text of the Bible with the King James Version. And I was thinking, man, you got that reversed. It was a good translation for 1611, although it stole a bunch of the Geneva Bible. But look at little plagiarism charges. No, but it wasn't. But there's people who just think the King James is inspired, and I've had friends like that, and good friends. And it's like, it's an interesting discussion and debate. But at some point, I remember my wife, she was like walking down the street, she met some guy witnessing or something, and she's like, oh, I'm a believer. Oh, what version of the Bible do you read? And it's like, she knew where he was going with that. She's like, I just ate Indian food. I'm not, not reading Bible right now at all. But, here's the thing. You can get in all kinds of discussions and things about, and if you prefer the King James, awesome. Read the King James. I would disagree with you on that it's the inspired word of God. I think the originals were. But here's the thing. I've gotten to the point where I'm just like, ain't nobody got time for that. Like, I just don't want to get in an argument about, like, silly things. And, and so, and some people are going to see certain things differently. We can have discussions and things, but I'm not going to get caught up in an argument about things that just aren't that important. Now, if you're, if you want to talk about Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses or, big things that kind of divert from the faith, I will have that conversation with you. But I've learned to fight over the substantive things, not the trivial. John 13:35 says, your love for one another will prove that you're my disciples. Not they'll know your disciples by your quibbling discussions over silly things. Which is why I often have to walk away from social media. If some of you follow me on Twitter, X, or whatever, I'm not interesting to follow on there at all because I don't tweet much. But I do like to read and kind of get a feel for the culture and what people are saying. And one of my favorite proverb cluster of couplets of Proverbs is Proverbs 26, verses 4 and 5 say, do not answer the foolish argument of fools, or you will become as foolish as they are. Or, the next one which says, be sure to answer the foolish arguments of fools, or they will become wise in their own estimation. Which they almost seem contradictory, and I think that's why they're right next to each other, because it beautifully captures a truth, which, I've told you the great theologian Kenneth Rogers once wrote, you've got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, know when to walk away, and know when to run. And so, it's easy to get caught up in arguing about silly things when you're in churches. It's easy to get, caught up in, I have my theological, train that I'm on. I have my, our tradition that we're in. And there's going to be other churches, other places that see certain things differently. And I'm just not going to get in a fight over a lot of that stuff. If you want a discussion and have coffee, great. But if you want to spend time quibbling, not so much. And truth is, like most of us, like I'm self-diagnosed ADD. They didn't have ADD diagnoses when I was a kid, but I show a lot of the signs. I've had to learn to kind of put myself in certain situations so I can learn, because I'm so easily distracted. And I think all of us are, and that's why what Paul's getting at here is don't get distracted by silly stuff. I have to put myself in a quiet place, or I have to put myself in the mall, one or the other, where I have to focus, and or I'll be up till 1 a.m. trying to get my work done, like I try to teach my kids not to do. Ultimately, there's a lot of foolish things that can distract and occupy us. But like Paul, we want to be focused on the gospel, the good news, and we want to be focused on living it. And there are a lot of distractions that keep us off task. How many of us have texted while driving? How many of us are lying about that? We shouldn't, but we often do. We pass laws against it, But it's still easy to find yourself looking at your phone. Technically, you can't even when you're at the stoplight. Did you know that? Yeah, you didn't know that. Now you're like, oh, I did do it. It's true with our phones. It's true with our faith. It's easy to get distracted, and every day in life, it's like we should remember the gospel, and the gospel is something that should never grow old. Kind of like Rocky movies. There's certain movies we all have that we can watch 100 times, and it should be Rocky. Unlike Rocky, it's the gospel is this life-changing story if you let it be, and you remember that Christ gives us true life, and I think that's something that so many people miss out on. All the things that we put in our lives that aren't what Christ would have us to put in, aren't the godly things God has for us. It's because we think it's going to bring us a better life. But John 10:10 says, I've come that they may have life and have it to the full. And when you live by his ways, you live in the way he would call you to live. I encourage you to read the Sermon on the Mount. It's hard, but it's a better way of life and a better way of living.